Hello and welcome back to the Sensitivity Doctor. This is Dr. Amelia Kelley, your host, and today I talked to one of my favorite brilliant women, Dr. Jessica Stern. She is a clinical psychologist, and I met her on XM Radio, the psychiatry show, where we unpacked all different things about ADHD. And today we had a really interesting conversation about a pretty scary article that just came out. If anyone has seen it, it is talking about the impact of ADHD and mortality. And so everyone here can get the right, accurate information. We took a deep dive into this article. And the thing I love the most about this episode is that I think you're going to leave feeling empowered rather than fearful about your potential diagnosis or the diagnosis of someone that you love. So I hope you enjoy this episode and that you find the level of empowerment and comfort and ideas and ways to prioritize your health while living with ADHD. Enjoy. Thank you for coming back to the Sensitivity Doctor. I think you're like now officially a friend of the podcast because I just love having you on here. And I have to say, I very personally am very excited to talk about this topic because I feel like it's something that I can work on, to be completely honest. And that is toxic overproductivity. So, or some other way of putting it. But, we hear a lot about the hustle culture and always being on. So when does productivity cross over from something that's positive to something that's toxic? And why is this something you're so interested in, like, helping people with? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me back to talk about. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So the reason I'd say it's one of my favorite areas to talk about is because it resonates with me personally as well. I kind of joke that I am like a recovering hustler in the sense that I was always an overachiever. I love studying about productivity. I was always the kind of person that was trying to learn more about how to maximize your efficiency and be organized as best as possible and do more and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that I kind of got sucked into almost this glamorized notion of working so hard that you're hustling and almost being proud of the fact that you were always busy. And I just love achieving. And I think that is one of my strengths. And at the same time, it's something that has consistently burnt me out. And over the course of time, I started to learn ways to essentially work smarter, not harder, and to be very proud of being an achiever while also not over-identifying with being one, and to essentially just come up with tips and tricks and sustainable strategies to be able to manage your productivity where you're working in a way that feels aligned with what's important to you and really just maximizing efficiency. And it's over the course of time, I started to call it my sort of non-toxic productivity framework. And then it just really stuck. And the reason I think it really stuck is because for a lot of people, especially very high achievers who I was working with, both in terms of my therapy practice and also in terms of my corporate clients, is a lot of people found that being so immersed in this hustle culture and also just trying to find ways to balance their work life was essentially feeling toxic to them in the sense that they were just consistently being burnt out over and over again. And so when I started to talk about it as non-toxic productivity, people were like, oh, I love that. No more toxicity. I have no more time, no more energy for it. And so that's really where I started to hone in on being able to teach people how to, again, just work smarter, not harder.
I love that so much because I feel like sometimes there's a little bit too much of a black and white with this, like almost vilifying productivity also, like not allowing people who do like to be high achievers to be high achievers. And so I like that idea, and I'm very selfishly interested today in how to make sure that you're leaning into productivity in a way that's helpful, not hurtful. And like, how do you know when you're crossing over? And I don't know if it's something that you explore, but I'm always so curious also how to tell the difference between toxic productivity and trauma flight mode?
Awesome question.
Right. So we'll get there. We'll get there. So how
Yeah.
would you, if someone listening is thinking, I wonder if this is something I struggle with, what would you say are early signs or ways to identify that maybe you are crossing over from healthy productivity? What did you say? Non-toxic
Yeah.
productivity to toxic productivity?
So first off, I just want to address something you just said because I'm so glad you said that, where it oftentimes feels like for people who are high achievers and really value productivity, that is vilified. And I strongly believe that that's not worth doing. It's not appropriate. If someone really enjoys achieving and really enjoys being productive, that's wonderful. Let them do that. Let them be that. I
Right.
think the places where you might want to sort of interject or you might want to self-explore is if you are overly invested in that, where it's becoming a sense of identity for you, which we know can then lead to perfectionisms and fears of failure and all those types of things. And also if it's draining you so much so that it's actually impacting your ability to live your life, which gets to the second question of where is that
Yeah.
line?
Yeah, I'm looking at you with this face of like, oh, okay, because I don't think I've ever identified, like I've never tried to identify as being productive, even though I think I'm sure every I guess I would say hyper productive or very productive person has probably had someone in their life say to them before, I don't know how you do it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like a compliment, but then it also feels like a suspicion or a judgment or something, or like you need to kind of explain yourself in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So I could see that part of it, but then also, the other aspect of it that I feel like is separate that I definitely want to make sure we talk about is the drain part, like how to be productive when you actually really super love what you do. And I'm totally talking about myself right now.
Yeah.
So, okay, so it's a fine line. How can you figure out if that's where you're headed?
So the short answer of this is essentially if all of your energy and your effort feels like it's propelling you towards things that are filling your cup up and are adding juice to your life, that's typically a good thing. However, if you are expending so much time and energy to something or to things where it's actually eventually starting to drain you, typically in other
Okay.
areas of your life, so
Okay.
on average, you're sort of at a negative, like a net negative in terms of energy, motivation, resources, all of that. That's typically where it's becoming what I would consider to be quote unquote non-toxic or toxic rather. And so what I oftentimes recommend people to do is to consider, are your efforts, and more specifically, and this is where I kind of talk about tangible tips, is are your systems driving you to efficiency and efficacy, or are you spending so much time and effort doing so many things that you're drained, which is one piece. And the second piece is, are you focusing your time and energy so much on making your systems effective and efficient that you're actually so focused on the process that that's diluting from the actual tasks that you're doing? So that I think is an important piece. Sometimes people are so focused on having the perfect calendar system and having their planners perfectly coiffed and everything like that, where it's sort of like they're so focused on the structure of trying to contain their time and their energy and their planning
Right.
that they actually don't have any time and energy left to actually do the things.
So I know we recently discussed ADHD. I feel like this is something I see a lot with people with ADHD, however, where they get more concerned about setting up the system and having, a beautiful calendar or, kind of organizing the organization, but then the execution doesn't happen. So like how could someone navigate that if that's just kind of what their brain gravitates towards?
This is a great question. I experience that a ton in individuals I work with ADHD, and also with people who don't have ADHD but are maybe a little bit more prone to anxiety and whatever it might
Oh,
be,
yeah, good point.
perfectionism. But I think that's an awesome question. I see this all the time, all the time. If you're spending so much time on your systems that you're not actually getting to doing the tasks, I mean, obviously that's going to be a problem. But sometimes people spend so much time on the systems, and then when they go to do the tasks, it's either they feel daunted by it, they feel like the systems actually didn't help them. It was almost like a little bit of a ruse where they were trying to focus so much time and energy on it, but it didn't actually translate, like it didn't convert into increased output or whatever it might be. So I think that's a challenge. What I always say to people is to think about, did it help you achieve something, or is it actually something that you're using to avoid doing the task?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Huh. So let's say hypothetically, you have a system and you're like, okay, I'm going to do less of the planning. Now you've stripped that away. What if you're still feeling drained or overwhelmed? And actually, I think this might be a good moment to identify what the symptoms or signs of burnout are, because it can be different for different people. And I was also incredibly intrigued by, I read a study once that was saying that, we think a weekend of relaxation is going to help you overcome burnout. But I read that it can take, I don't want to freak people out, but it can take up to years sometimes for people to overcome burnout. So I guess the reason I want to ask you about this now is before we start venturing into other coping skills, it almost feels like to me there might be a different way to handle productivity if you are already burnt out versus if you have not yet burnt out.
Absolutely. So let's take a moment here to park. I love that idea of talking a little bit about burnout. So the signs and symptoms of burnout largely relate to energy, motivation, and mood. But there are a variety of others, but that's kind of a general way to think about it. Is if you find that you are feeling apathetic in doing the things that you want to do or the things that you need to do, that's potentially a sign. If you're feeling just completely drained and low energy, regardless of what you do, regardless of how much sleep you have, regardless of whether you take a day off, regardless of whether you didn't do anything for the weekend, that's another sign. If you feel like you're getting snappy or irritable, if you're finding that it's hard for you to relate or to connect with people in your life, whether it's your coworkers or your loved ones, that's potentially another sign. These are ways that you can sort of assess, like, am I in the right headspace? Am I feeling disconnected from the world around me? Am I feeling disconnected from my tasks and my workflows? These are all, I think, important features to consider. Difficulties with attention and concentration that feel like they're new onset. So why I say new onset is for people with ADHD who've chronically had difficulties.
Right.
That might not necessarily be a burnout thing, but if you
Right.
historically haven't had difficulty with this and now this feels like something new, that might potentially be a sign of burnout. And it's oftentimes this sort of like, I just feel disconnected from my life. I feel like I have no energy to do anything. I feel very lost, potentially, a lot of guilt, a lot of shame. Those, I think, are some of the most common signs and symptoms of burnout for people.
Do you think it's possible to be burnt out in one area, but then kind of revived and rejuvenated in another? Because I'm thinking of like being a working mom. Sometimes I'll get a little parental burnout and I might feel some more of those symptoms that you're talking about when I'm parenting. But then when I'm at work, suddenly I have more energy, or vice versa. Maybe I'm feeling burnt out with work and then I'm only feeling good when I'm out doing something fun with my kids. Like, yeah.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, that's actually one of the main distinguishers between depression. So oftentimes burnout and depression
Oh,
can look very similar. But what we
okay.
know is that typically with burnout, it's most commonly related to one domain of your life or one primary domain of your life. So it doesn't have to be just one, but it's usually one thing that's driving the thing. So maybe that's your job, maybe that's your caretaking role, maybe it's parenting, and you might feel subsequent sort of trickling down effects of burnout in other areas of your life. Whereas in depression, it's typically where you feel these ways, lack of energy, disconnection, lack of motivation, sort of consistently throughout your life,
Everywhere.
like in all domains. Yeah.
That is super interesting. I've never thought of it that way or heard that. And I am so glad that you distinguish that. I feel like as a therapist, that is a new question I need to start checking in with my clients about. Because it is kind of a natural tendency if they're feeling apathetic or anhedonia, where you lose interest in things you used to like to do, or just feeling irritable or any of that. I feel like the initial clinical response is to think, okay, well, we should examine depression. But that is so interesting that if it's only showing up in certain domains, it's probably more so burnout. Okay. I feel like, our society right now is just primed for burnout. I feel like from the way we had talked about in the previous time I had you on about women overloading themselves and aggravating ADHD symptoms. So this is a perfect time for a course like the one you're going to have and the coaching you're going to offer. Why do you think our culture is so fixated on being so dang productive? And when, how do we know that? I guess it sounds like to me that we know we're being positively productive when it feels fulfilling and when it's for us as opposed to being for everyone else. Is that?
For sure. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. So, interest in productivity in general, scientifically and sort of academically, is not new. So, there are a lot of researchers that have been looking at productivity for a long time. Productivity apps have been around for a very long time. But I do think that there is this sort of resurgence out there in society from the average person who's a little bit more curious about this. And I think there's a couple of reasons for why. One is burnout is on the rise. And so naturally, people feel like they either want to increase or optimize their productivity to reduce their burnout. Or kind of conversely, they feel like they're so productive or they're so hyper fixated on being productive that it's actually burning them out. So I think that's one feature, is the burnout feature. I think the other feature too is that particularly with technology, we are being pulled in so many more ways than historically we have been.
Oh my gosh, yes.
It's draining. It is absolutely so exhausting.
There's no way to not be available. I love watching old movies or even books where, like Home Alone. Home Alone would never happen anymore because everyone has cell phones. Everyone, you know what I mean? Things like that couldn't even, those storylines aren't even possible anymore because human beings are available way outside their tribe all the time.
Absolutely. 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 And I think the problem is that the more input we have, and by input, I mean sort of in terms of data and information and all of this, the more information we receive from apps on our phone, from Slack, from email, all these things, means that we're having to manage so much more in terms of stimulation, in terms of information. We're needing to process so much more. And I also think that in modern society, we just have so many more roles and responsibilities. And so I think for that reason, there is this drive or this interest, or honestly, I think this necessity to really optimize productivity. And even if you don't identify as someone who's an achiever or an overachiever, even if you're just kind of like just trying to skirt by, there might be this need or this urge to be able to optimize your ability to just get things done and to just manage your life, which I think leads to this sort of increased curiosity in productivity.
Okay, so as a chronic hyperachiever, someone who always has projects, I feel happier when I have projects and things to dig my teeth into. It's very exciting to me. But I do recognize that if I'm doing too much of it, I can tend to be more irritable, especially towards my husband. Or, my sleep will get impacted, or kind of a low hum of chronic like back pain is those are kind of the signals to me that I'm way overdoing it. How would you say to someone like myself who loves to achieve, who loves to, and I don't even know if it's achieve. I don't really care about achieving, honestly. I love to do things. I love to like, do you think there's a difference between achieve and accomplish?
That's a great question. I
Because
think it
I'd like to accomplish things, but I'm not really as concerned about achieving things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a very good distinction. You want to get things done. So one is sort of like the checking things off. So I
I
think the
love that.
accomplishing,
I love
me
that.
too. Me too.
Yeah.
And then for a lot of people, the achieving is sort of like moving up,
Yeah.
moving forward, sort of growth oriented. That's I would say that's like a little bit of a crude distinction of it. It's like a little bit more nuanced than that. But I think that's largely what it is. I think that you're describing that distinction.
Okay. And I mean, not that we don't all like achieving, but I think I would
Totally.
definitely say I love accomplishing. I even find it satisfying when you finish a tube of toothpaste. And then you grab a new tube of toothpaste. It's so weird. But so someone like me who really, really loves accomplishing things, but I can tend to overload myself. What would you tell me to do?
Oh my goodness. I am your sister in this because I feel this way as well, which is why I'm so interested in this. So there are a couple of pieces. One is I would encourage you to ask yourself why you enjoy accomplishing things. And that's awesome. We don't want to do it in a way where we sort of unravel that, but sort of say, like, what do I get out of this? Because clearly it's driving something interesting, fun, exciting, whatever it might be. And then what I would also do is as you're starting to add things to your docket, tasks you want to accomplish, products you want to, or projects you want to pursue, whatever it might be, is to add them in a way that you could contemplate them before you start to dive in. Because I think that a lot of people start them really quickly, and I have been guilty of this as well, start them really quickly and then start too many things all at once, and then they've got a lot of things going. So it's almost similar to how I think about people who want to potentially curb their shopping habits is put the thing in your shopping cart, let it sit there for a couple days, a couple of weeks. If you still want it later, you can buy it.
Oh, I love that.
Similar to this, if you have a lot of projects and you're like, oh, I'm flowing, I've got so much inspiration and energy, awesome.
Yeah.
Don't quell that. Add it to a list, brainstorm things, add just little musings that you have. Give it a couple days to simmer. And that way, A, you can decide how you want to stagger it, how you want to implement it into your schedule and your workflow. And B, it also gives you an opportunity to sort of pause and decide, is this a now thing? Is this a later thing? Or maybe did I decide that it's not actually worth it and it can be a never thing? So now, later, never.
I really love that. I find the never things are the things that I drag my feet on more. And the now things are the things that I have to stop myself from doing. You know, like you get into it and you're like, oh gosh, I've been doing this for a while. I need to stop. The maybe ones I can only, did you say now, never? What was the middle one again?
Later.
Later. Okay. Yeah. The later ones, I have a couple laters in my docket now that I think about it. And I feel like the laters are more like if all this time opens up randomly, maybe I'll get to that. But I'm happy I haven't committed to the laters now that I think about it. That's a good way to look at that.
It just gives you a little bit of time to sort of plan for it, to make sure that there's the allocated time, energy, resources for it. It just gives you an opportunity to sort of prep for it. Because I think part of the issue is that oftentimes people like you and I get really excited about things and have this burst of energy and excitement and inspiration. And the problem is that if we start too many things all at once, we don't have enough of those resources. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough energy. Maybe we don't have enough other resources for these things to do all of these things at once. And so we need to be a little bit more planful and thoughtful to sort of phase them out and to stagger them such that we can appropriately, it's essentially pacing. Allocate that, those resources accordingly rather than stripping ourselves of them, which can eventually lead to burnout.
This feels really important too when I consider as a highly sensitive, high sensation seeking person. like myself. So for HSPs who also get really passionate and excited about a lot of things, I do think we can tend to, like, I sometimes giggle when I think about the movie Tomb Raider. When I watched it forever ago, I remember watching it, turning it off, and like turning to my parents and being like, I need to join Taekwondo now. Like it
Oh
was
my
like
gosh.
immediately like these ideas, and they actually let me, and then I quit very shortly after. So it's like this like excitement if you just dig in and you say yes to everything right in that moment.
Hmm.
You don't get to actually see if it fits into your life and if it fits kind of
Precisely.
sequentially with your values of what you have. Like I might be able to say yes to everything, but then what about being a mom, or being a spouse, or being a business owner, like all these other things. When you think about like HSPs too, I think about how they can take all this on, and then the overload can happen a lot more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned the values because that's actually one of the core essential features of the way that I think about non-toxic productivity. It's actually module 1 of my course.
I haven't read it
And
either.
it's so important.
Yeah.
And the reason is that the way that I think about making productivity much more efficient and sustainable
Hmm.
is about thinking about how the tasks that you do and the things that you engage in fit into your value system such that you feel like it's actually adding meaning to your life or it's making things a little bit more efficient rather than not. And I think exactly like you're saying, what's oftentimes happening is we're having competing values all at the same time. And so if you value your role in your job and you also value your role as a parent, likely those are going to be like more or less largely similar. One might be a little bit more important to you than the other. That's up for you to decide. But the issue is that if you get sort of this sudden burst of energy and inspiration to do a whole bunch in one domain, it's not necessarily going to leave you with enough energy for the other. And so pausing gives you an opportunity to sort of zoom out and say, okay, I've got a couple of important things to me that are all happening at the same time. How can I make sure that I allocate time and energy to pace along the way? And this kind of gets at my philosophy side note, like a little bit of a sidebar of work-life balance and things of this nature is that I believe that you can have work-life balance. It's just that the balance is on average, not all at the same time. And
Oh,
so
okay.
at any given point, you might be a little bit more weighted on one dimension than
Right.
another. But if on average, every so often you sort of evaluate and say, on average, I have balance, like that's key. That's awesome.
That makes
Um,
sense. It kind of makes me think of how they say no relationship is 50-50 all the
yep.
time.
Exactly. Exactly.
Can you hear the train?
Yes.
Let's pause for 1 second. Camille can like cut it out, but I was saying something about the 50-50 thing. I think that's it. It only does 3 toots. And it comes like twice a day. But no, so it makes me think of how I've heard before, like people say with relationships 50-50, but really realistically, there's always going to be someone slightly, and hopefully it goes back and forth, like slightly pulling a little bit more of whether it be the labor weight, the emotional weight, whatever that is at the time.
Exactly. I think of it very, very similarly.
So, one thing that I've kind of loved when I think about, I first and foremost, I love your idea of now, later, never, and pausing and really looking and thinking like maybe I don't need to say yes to a new book at the same time that there's a big birthday party I like to throw for my child, or like maybe pacing things, and looking, actually looking, not just saying yes. I do feel sometimes a little bit of FOMO, like fear of missing out, like you're afraid not to say yes, like you're afraid the opportunities will be gone if you don't say yes.
Yes. So
Yes.
this is so common. I'm saying yes because I'm like, oh, yes, I hear it all the time. So a couple things. I think that this is probably one of the biggest motivators for people saying yes to things, aside from people pleasing. Those are probably two of the biggest reasons that people say yes to things that they don't necessarily want to do or that they don't have the time and energy to do, even if they want to. I think there are a couple of strategies around this. One is oftentimes if you have an opportunity for something, you will likely have an opportunity for it again. So this idea that you won't ever have that opportunity is not traditionally or not commonly true. Occasionally it's true. There are opportunities and circumstances
If
that are
Oprah
maybe...
calls, I'm coming. Like that's, yeah.
Exactly. Like that's maybe something that's not likely to
Right.
happen quite so quickly again.
Right.
But I think for the majority of life circumstances, you will likely have that opportunity again. The other thing too is that I think that there are ways that you can say no with keeping the door open within your control and with your boundaries. So for instance, maybe saying no to that opportunity, but saying, I'd love to stay in touch. Or maybe you say no now, and then a couple months pass by, you reach back out to that person and say, I loved that idea of collaboration or whatever it might be. I have a little bit more time and capacity at this time. Do you think it might be something that we can explore again? And so there are ways, I think sometimes people feel like once they close the door, they close it forever. And that's actually not so true most of the time.
Right.
And so there are ways that you can do that. There's this other concept that I kind of accidentally came up with in a therapy session one day. I was meeting with a client and I came up with this concept of micro declining.
Oh, okay. What's that?
I feel like I should trademark this term.
You should.
Thank you. Micro declining is when you say no to an aspect of something without necessarily saying no to the whole thing.
Okay.
Or you set a boundary around an aspect of that thing without saying no to the whole thing. And sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's not. So for instance, let's say you have a ton of things to do on your calendar for a specific week. A couple of friends are in town. They say, hey, do you want to go to this party? And you're thinking to yourself, I have a really important presentation the next day. I can't stay late. If I stay late, I'm going to get sucked in and then I'm going to be out late and it's going to be a whole thing. So what you can do is you can say, I need to leave by X time. Maybe you don't even tell anybody that. Or let's say someone says, I'd love a ride to this party. And you think to yourself, okay, if I say yes to giving them a ride to the party, I'm going to need to wait until they're ready to leave to give them a ride back, which means that maybe I'm going to be stuck at the party later than I want to be.
Right.
So what you could do is at the beginning, you can say, love to give you a ride to the party on the way there. I unfortunately won't likely be able to give you a ride back. Can you make those arrangements ahead of time? So it's this small little micro decline, which might seem really obvious or really silly, but I think oftentimes we as humans think of things in all or nothing terms.
Right.
Where we don't consider the dimensions or the gradations of something such that we can actually think about ways to kind of set soft or small boundaries on a thing that can actually limit or improve our energy levels.
I love that. I remember doing something similar. It was with a boundary. My first business ever was a little mini photography business. And it's kind of what taught me how to do business and all this. And for anyone who remembers back in the day when we did that. And I remember a friend asking me if I would photograph their child's first birthday party. And I wanted to be a guest. Like I just wanted to come and enjoy the party, and they weren't offering to pay me. So I think I micro declined because I paused, I checked in. And I think that's important to note because a lot of people, I think, feel like they have to have a response right away. So they don't get to check in with themselves and see how they really feel about something.
Absolutely.
Right. So if you tend to be a people pleaser or someone who FOMO yeses like I do sometimes, pausing is good. And I remember pausing and really checking in about how I felt, realized how I felt. And so I told her, I really just want to be able to be a guest, but I would love to photograph the cake. You know how they do the first birthday where they eat the cake and all that. So I offered to photograph the cake and photograph a couple of pictures of the family. And then I was able to relax the rest of the time. And it felt really good. Like it felt like I was able to do something nice that she appreciated, but I also was able to enjoy the party. So does that sound like a micro decline?
Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, give myself a pat on the back for that one.
Please do. Absolutely.
So I love the idea of micro declining. And I think if I was going to take this the next step, so you've checked in, you've maybe micro declined, you've looked at your calendar, you've figured it out, but you still have a lot on it. You're still having some burnout symptoms. I heard an interesting quote recently, something about like not productivity, resting is productive. The idea of if you're someone who maybe, as I was saying earlier, tends to get into flight mode, or you're constantly doing, whether it be because you are trying not to feel anxious about something, or you feel a hyper responsibility, whatever that driving force is, being able to be still and not be productive can be really uncomfortable. Do you have any advice? Because it sounds to me like that might be part of this being non-toxically productive, is being able to stop and rest.
Absolutely. And I think that for a lot of people, being productive and by proxy being busy is a way to cover up other distress or to distract from other uncomfortable experiences. Like anxiety, for instance. That's a really big one. When people are really anxious, oftentimes they will overdo. They'll do a lot so that way they can distract from their anxiety. This is also true for people who experience trauma. People who are people pleasers, oftentimes they will do a lot to avoid, to cover up, to run away from some of these uncomfortable feelings. And maybe that's what they were taught to do. So it's not necessarily their fault at all. This might be what they were trained to do. And so I would say for people who feel uncomfortable with rest, with stillness, with breaks, is step one is to get really curious, very honestly with yourself in a very non-judgmental way of why do I feel so uncomfortable with this? What is going on for me? And to observe. And you're not going to get that answer right away. It might take a little bit of time. It might take multiple opportunities of you observing this, but to understand what happens for you when you do slow down, when you're forced to slow down, what is occurring from you? What's this sort of restlessness that you feel in your body or your mind that's coming up for yourself? And then to start to explore, okay, how do I change my relationship to that? And you can ask yourself, in what ways does staying very busy serve me well? Because it's being reinforced by something.
Right.
And in what ways is it holding me back, or is it actually getting in the way? And I think that people oftentimes, when they struggle with this, over-identify with the ways that it serves me well and sort of avoid the ways in which it actually slows me down or holds me back. And looking at that second part very non-judgmentally, I think, is important, because that's when you can really start to lean into the cost-benefit analysis of why is it worthwhile for me to change my habits and my styles.
I love that so much. And I guess if I was going to ask one last question about this, just really taking everything that you've offered today, and I'm so grateful too, because I know you're giving us an inside scoop on some of the stuff you're going to be doing in your courses and the coaching. So I'm very appreciative that you've been willing to share some of your really cool ideas. Sorry, I got so distracted by that person walking by. I saw like a human being.
Can we edit that out?
Yeah. No, it's fine. I'll just ask again.
I appreciate.
That was fun. Well, because she would have had to edit, because you literally could see the shadow. I'm assuming is your partner or something walking by. That was funny. Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, it's so funny. So I'm really appreciative of you sharing all of this, because I know you're really giving us an inside scoop to a lot of the things for your coaching and your program. What would you say for someone who is feeling burnt out, but still has a lot to do, still has a lot they want to do, and they really want to adopt the things that you've talked about today? They're planning on not saying yes to anything new, but they want to feel good. What would you say to support them going forward?
Such a wonderful question. So I would first start off by asking yourself, what does feeling good mean and what does feeling good look like? Because I think that's going to vary from person to person. And oftentimes one of the biggest tips that I give to people, especially when they ask this question, and sometimes they'll say, I don't really know, I'm not really sure, is you can actually backwards engineer this question by what doesn't feel good. And then you can take what doesn't feel good and sort of use that to sort of source the information and inspiration about what will feel good. The thing I'd say I would leave this sort of tip or piece of reflection for people here is really what we want to do. A lot of this is about playing the short game and the long game at the same time. So being reactive in the sense that you're sort of responding to the things that are not working well now in the moment. Let's say your calendar is really booked up and you feel really overwhelmed, and for the next 2 or 3 weeks, there's not much you can do about it. Is sort of responding a little bit reactively to that, and playing a little bit of defense in that way to sort of manage the acute distress about it. And then being proactive for the future. And that's where setting up systems, changing your habits, a lot of that can be helpful. And I think that if you can sort of give your grace to understand that some of it's going to be a little bit acute, some of it's going to be the mid to long game, then it can, I think, ultimately slow you down in terms of feeling overwhelmed that you need to finish the race really fast.
Right.
And that you don't need to look for a quick fix in this.
I love that, because there really is not going to be a quick fix, especially because, as you and I know from us trying to plan you coming to my ADHD group, sometimes you're planning things 3 months out.
Yes, exactly.
So
I am not immune to this, by the way.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much. Honestly, like I'm excited to take some of the things that you talked about today and go apply it to my own life. So if people want to learn more about this new program you're putting together and the offerings you have around this, where can they find that and what should they be looking for?
Absolutely. Okay, so you can find me on my website, which is Dr. Jessica B. Stern, B as in boy, drjessicabstern.com. You can also find me on Instagram. My handle is Dr. Jessica B. Stern. And the productivity course, if you are listening prior to May of 2025, at the time of recording,
Probably will be.
Yes.
Maybe.
You can visit my website and Instagram for the wait list. And then if
Awesome.
you are listening as a future listener or you're coming back to listen again to this, then the program will be live and you can visit my website. And again, it'll be linked on Instagram where you can purchase the course and learn about some of the other offerings that I have. I'll also have a lot of free resources on my website for people to download. So hopefully you'll find something that you're looking for on those platforms.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for helping our listeners and helping me today. I really appreciate it. So, okay, be well, everyone.